August 14th, 1971. Stanford University, California. A young graduate student named Dave Eshelman woke up that morning and ate breakfast the same way he always did. He drove to campus. He walked across the quad. He was 22 years old, studying to be a teacher, and by most accounts he was a gentle person, the kind of person his friends would have described as thoughtful, measured, slow to anger. He arrived at the basement of Jordan Hall, put on a uniform he had been given the day before, and within 48 hours, he would become someone that even he did not recognize. Not because he was told to become that person. Not because he was threatened or coerced, but because of something far simpler and far more disturbing than any of that. Because of a door, a corridor, a role, and the quiet, almost invisible pressure of a situation that told him, without words, who he now was. What happened to Dave Eshelman in that basement is one of the most documented, most debated, and most deeply uncomfortable stories in the history of psychological science. And the reason it still matters, the reason it has not faded into a footnote like so many other studies from that era, is not because of what it revealed about Dave Eshelman. It is because of what it revealed about you. About the person you are right now, sitting wherever you are, certain in the quiet confidence that you would never do what those people did. That certainty, as it turns out, is not a sign of your character. It is a symptom of the exact same cognitive mechanism that allowed everything to happen in the first place. And it is exactly these questions, the ones that make us uncomfortable enough to look away, that the human code was made to answer. So here is the question this entire story builds toward, not whether you are a good person. You probably are, not whether you have values. You do. The question is this. Under the right conditions, with the right framing, surrounded by the right signals about who you are supposed to be, how long would it take before those values became negotiable, not abandoned, not violated in some dramatic, obvious moment you could recognize and resist? Just quietly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly negotiable. How long? Because the data has an answer, and the answer is shorter than you think. Philip Zimbardo was 38 years old in the summer of 1971, and by most accounts he was not a detached academic. He was passionate, almost evangelical, about the power of social situations to shape human behavior. He had grown up in poverty in the South Bronx, where he watched intelligent and fundamentally decent people become what their circumstances demanded of them. He had spent years studying obedience, conformity, de-individuation, the processes by which individuals dissolve into roles. He was not conducting a curiosity experiment. He had a thesis that human evil was not primarily a function of bad people but of bad systems, that the situation mattered more than the soul. He wanted to prove it, and he wanted to prove it in a way so clean and controlled that it could not be dismissed. This study he designed was simple in structure and catastrophic in outcome. He would create a mock prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology department. He would take a group of healthy, psychologically screened, middle-class college students, people who had passed extensive background checks and personality assessments, people who had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, no signs of authoritarian tendencies, and he would randomly assign half of them to be guards and half to be prisoners. That randomness was the point. There was no selection process by character, no profiling, no attempt to find people who seemed more suited to dominance or submission. A coin flip. That was the entire selection mechanism. A coin flip. Zimbardo recruited his participants through a classified advertisement in local newspapers, offering $15 a day, the equivalent of roughly $100 today, to healthy male volunteers willing to participate in a study of prison life. 75 men applied. From those, Zimbardo and his team selected 24, choosing only those who showed the most psychological stability and normalcy. These were the least likely to crack, the most well-adjusted, the most wholesome by every metric they can measure. On August 14th, those 24 men were randomly divided. 12 would be guards, 12 would be prisoners. The guards were given khaki uniforms. Wooden batons mirrored sunglasses. The sunglasses mattered because they prevented prisoners from making eye contact, and Because Zimbardo had read research suggesting that the inability to see another person's eyes reduces the capacity for empathy on both sides, the prisoners were assigned numbers, not names, numbers. They were referred to only by those numbers throughout the study. They wore smocks and rubber sandals. They had chains bolted to their ankles. These were not dramatic Hollywood props. They were carefully chosen tools of psychological transformation. Zimbardo understood that identity is not stable. Identity is constructed moment to moment from the signals the environment sends about who you are. What happened next unfolded so quickly that even Zimbardo, who designed the entire thing and who expected to find something significant, was not prepared. The prisoners were arrested at their homes on the morning of August 14th by actual Palo Alto police officers, in coordination with Zimbardo's team. They were handcuffed, placed in police cars, driven to the station, booked, and then transferred to the Stanford basement. This was not in the original briefing. The arrest was a surprise, and Zimbardo included it deliberately, because he understood that the psychological shift needed to begin before the study did, that the transition from civilian to prisoner had to feel real, not simulated. Several of the young men reported feeling genuine fear during the arrest. One said he felt his stomach drop when the handcuffs clicked shut, even though he had signed the consent form and knew on some level that this was an experiment. The body did not know. The body responded to the situation. By the end of the first day, the guards had begun to improvise. This is the detail that researchers returned to again and again. Zimbardo had given the guards almost no specific instructions. He told them only that they were responsible for maintaining order, that they could not use physical violence, and that they should make the prisoners feel powerless. Everything else, every humiliation, every exercise, every ritual of degradation that followed, was invented by the guards themselves. It was not scripted. It was not modeled. It emerged from the role, the way water finds the shape of whatever it is poured into. Dave Eshelman, the gentle 22-year-old who had eaten breakfast that morning the same way he always did, was by the second day one of the most aggressive guards in the study. He later recalled that he had made a deliberate decision early on to create a character, a persona he called John Wayne, who was nothing like him. He told himself it was performative, a role he was playing, separate from who he really was. But the behavior that came from the character was real. The sleep deprivation he enforced was real. The push-ups he demanded at 2 in the morning were real. The way he spoke to the prisoners, not as people but as numbers, not as individuals but as problems to be managed, was real. And here is what matters most. He did not feel like he was performing. By the second day, he felt like himself. The prisoners, for their part, began to respond in ways that also surprised the researchers. Within 36 hours, prisoner number 8612, a young man named Douglas Corpy, began to show signs of acute emotional distress. He cried uncontrollably. He raged. He told the guards he could not breathe, that he was going crazy, that he needed to leave. The guards and even some of the other prisoners assumed he was faking. Because how could the situation be real enough to cause genuine breakdown after only a day and a half? Zimbardo, watching from outside, also initially suspected manipulation. It took time for everyone, including the researchers, to understand that what they were seeing was not performance. The situation had already reached inside Douglas Corpy and rearranged something. Corpy was eventually released after 36 hours. He would later say that the breakdown was real, that the distress was genuine, and that even knowing he was in an experiment had not protected him from it. The knowledge and the experience, he said, existed in separate parts of his brain. He knew it was fake. He felt it was real, and the body, as always, sided with feeling. By the third day, a rebellion had broken out. Several prisoners barricaded themselves inside their cells, pushed their beds against the doors, and shouted through the barriers. The guards responded with a fire extinguisher, spraying the prisoners with a chemical blast to force them away from the doors. Then they took the leaders of the rebellion and put them in solitary confinement, a small closet in the corridor. Then they did something more psychologically sophisticated and more disturbing. They divided the prisoners into good and bad groups, giving the good prisoners better food, better treatment, cleaner conditions. Then they shuffled the groups. Some of the prisoners who had been in the good group were moved to the bad group. Some who had been in the bad group were moved to the good group. The point was not punishment and reward. The point was to create confusion about who had done what, to prevent prisoners from trusting each other, to fracture any sense of collective identity. The guards had arrived at this tactic on their own. They were college students with no training in psychology, no background in interrogation, no experience with institutional authority. They had been guards for 3 days, and they had independently reinvented a core technique of psychological coercion. It is worth pausing here to let that land. These were not cruel people who had been waiting for permission to be cruel. They were randomly selected students who had been assessed just days before as the most psychologically stable of 75 applicants. And by day 3, they were conducting psychologically sophisticated manipulation experiments on other human beings, unprompted, with no instruction, apparently because the role demanded it and the situation provided no reason to stop. By the 5th day, 3 more prisoners have been released due to severe emotional distress. The remaining prisoners had, to a significant degree, internalized their roles. They no longer consistently fought back. They began to regulate each other's behavior, reminding fellow prisoners to follow the rules and discouraging any action that might provoke the guards. They had become, in a meaningful psychological sense, complicit in their own imprisonment, not because they had been broken in some obvious dramatic way, but because the situation had lasted long enough and been consistent enough that compliance had begun to feel like the natural state, the way things simply were. If you've reached this point in the video and you're feeling unsettled in a way that feels important, that feeling is the point. Subscribing to the Human Code means the next time we go somewhere like this, you'll be there. Philip Zimbardo was not watching from a detached position of scientific neutrality. He had made himself the superintendent of the prison. He wore a uniform. He walked the corridors. He made decisions about discipline and logistics and character, not as a researcher. And here is the detail that he himself has described as the most disturbing finding of his career. He got lost, not confused, not temporarily caught up, lost. By the 4th and 5th day, he was thinking primarily as a prison superintendent, not as a psychologist. When a colleague named Christina Moslock, who would later become his wife, visited the basement and watched the prisoners being led to the bathroom in bags over their heads, in chains, being humiliated and harassed by guards, she said, "What you are doing to these boys is terrible." She was the only person in the entire study, observer or participant, who had said those words. She had not been inside the situation. She had not been assigned a role. She had walked in from the outside, and she could see what everyone inside had stopped seeing. Zimbardo, confronted by her reaction, said that in that moment he suddenly saw the study through different eyes. He shut it down the next morning. The study was terminated on August 20th, 1971, 6 days in, instead of the planned 14. Not because of the prisoners' suffering, which had been escalating for days, because one person standing outside the situation named what was happening. That detail, that it took someone from outside the situation to see it clearly, is not incidental. It is the mechanism that explains almost everything about what happened and about what happens in similar circumstances far beyond any laboratory. The human brain, as it turns out, did not evolve to evaluate situations from outside of them. It evolved to survive inside them. And survival inside a situation requires, above almost everything else, rapid categorization of roles. Who is in charge? Who is subordinate? What the rules are? What behavior is expected of which type of person? This categorization happens automatically, below the level of conscious decision-making. It happens faster than reflection. It happens in most cases before you have had a chance to ask whether the category is accurate or the rules are just. Neuroscientists call this automatic social processing. When you enter a new social environment, your brain immediately begins scanning for role cues, uniforms, titles, spatial arrangements, posture, tone of voice. Within seconds, it has constructed a preliminary model of the social hierarchy and your place within it. This is not a character flaw. This is the cognitive architecture that allowed human beings to function in complex social groups for hundreds of thousands of years. A brain that had to consciously deliberate about every social situation would be too slow to navigate the social world. So the brain automates it, and the automation runs whether you want it to or not. The problem, the deep, unsettling problem, is that this same architecture that allows us to navigate social situations also makes us vulnerable to being shaped by them. Because if the brain reads role cues automatically and adjusts behavior to match, then the nature of the role cues matters enormously. A uniform matters. A title matters. The architecture of a space, whether it looks like a prison or an office or a classroom, matters. Not because we consciously think about these things, but because the brain processes them and updates its model of who we are and what is expected of us, and behavior follows from that model almost before we are aware of it. This is why the mirrored sunglasses that Zimbardo gave his guards mattered so much. They were not just symbolic. They were a specific intervention in the brain's social processing system. When you cannot see someone's eyes, your brain cannot perform the automatic empathy computation, the rapid unconscious modeling of another person's inner state that normally acts as a brake on aggressive behavior. Mirrored sunglasses don't just hide the guards' eyes from the prisoners. They hide the prisoners' eyes from the guards. And the guards, without that visual feedback loop, were less able to experience the prisoners as fully real, less able to feel, automatically and involuntarily, what the prisoners were feeling. And without that feeling, behavior that would otherwise have triggered internal alarm signals simply did not. This dehumanization mechanism is not unique to the Stanford prison experiment. It appears in the uniform studies of Henri Tajfel, who showed in the early 1970s that even entirely arbitrary group distinctions, groups based on nothing more than aesthetic preference for two different painters, were sufficient to trigger in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. Tajfel called this the minimal group paradigm. Minimal as in, this is the least possible basis for distinguishing groups. Preference for Clay over Kandinsky. And it was enough. It was enough for the brain to build a model of us and them, and to behave accordingly. What this means is that dehumanization is not a failure of morality in the conventional sense. It is not the result of a person deciding that another group of people does not deserve consideration. It is an automatic output of a system that divides the social world into categories and adjusts behavior based on category membership. The person does not choose to dehumanize. The system runs. And if nothing in the environment interrupts the system, if there is no Christina Maslock walking in from outside, the behavior continues. Here is where the research becomes specifically uncomfortable for you. As an individual, sitting with your values intact and your certainty about your own decency fully operational. Because there is a body of research, much of it conducted after the Stanford prison experiment, in direct response to it, that examined one very specific question. What predicts whether a person will resist situational pressure and maintain their values in circumstances like these? And the answer to that question is not what most people expect. It is not intelligence. Studies repeatedly find no significant correlation between measured intelligence and resistance to situational pressure in high-stakes social environments. It is not moral education. People who have studied ethics formally, who have read the philosophy, who can articulate sophisticated moral frameworks, show no reliable advantage over people who haven't. It is not even prior awareness of the specific phenomenon. Participants in replications and variations of Milgram's obedience studies, who were told before the study that most people in Milgram's original experiments had complied with authority even to the point of apparent lethal harm, were no more likely to resist than participants who had never heard of Milgram. What the research consistently finds is this. The best predictor of resistance to situational pressure is prior experience of having actually resisted situational pressure in the past. Not knowledge, not values, not character assessments. Behavior, specifically the embodied, practiced experience of having seen a situation pulling you in a direction, having noticed the pull, and having chosen differently. People who have done that in smaller, lower-stakes situations, in the ordinary texture of daily life, carry something in their nervous system that others do not. not a moral advantage, a practiced skill, a groove in the neural circuitry that runs in the direction of independent evaluation rather than automatic situational compliance. And here's the finding that lands most quietly and most heavily. In multiple studies examining people's predictions about their own behavior in hypothetical obedience or conformity scenarios, the people who expressed the greatest confidence that they would resist were, on average, among the most likely to comply when actually placed in the situation. Not because confident people are morally weaker, but because confidence, in this context, is almost always a symptom of not having imagined the situation in sufficient detail, of having judged it from the outside, where it looks obviously wrong, of never having felt the specific, almost physical pull of a situation that has already told you who you are. The people who said, "I don't know if I could resist, it would depend on so many things I can't predict," showed, on average, better resistance. Not because uncertainty is a moral virtue, but because that uncertainty reflected a more accurate model of how these situations actually work, a model that included the self as a variable rather than a fixed and reliable anchor. This is not accusation. It is not a claim that you're secretly cruel, or that you lack values, or that you would inevitably become a different and worse version of yourself in the right circumstances. It is a much more precise and much more important point. The confidence you feel right now reading this about what you would do. That confidence is generated by a part of your brain that has never been inside a situation like the ones described here. It is a prediction made without access to the most important variable, which is the felt experience of the situation itself. And that gap between the self you know from the outside and the self that exists inside situations, that gap is what Philip Zimbardo spent the rest of his career trying to map. In the decades after the Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo turned to what he called the Lucifer effect, his term for the process by which ordinary people come to do terrible things. He examined not just his own study, but a range of historical cases, from the behavior of soldiers in wartime to the conditions inside institutions ranging from corporations to religious organizations. He found the same architecture everywhere, a clear hierarchy with roles assigned and enforced, reduced individual accountability because responsibility was diffuse, dehumanization of a specific outgroup achieved through language, uniform, or spatial separation, and crucially, a narrative, an official story about why the behavior was necessary, justified, or even righteous. In every case, people who had families they loved, communities they served, values they sincerely held, found themselves inside a system that was producing behavior their prior selves would have condemned. And in almost every case, they did not see the transformation as it happened. They experienced continuity. They felt throughout like themselves. This is the part of the finding that is hardest to hold. Not that people do terrible things. History has always known that. The hard part is that they do not typically feel like they are doing terrible things while they are doing them. They feel like they are doing what is necessary, what is expected, what the situation demands. They feel, in other words, like themselves. Stanley Milgram had found this a decade before Zimbardo, in the early 1960s, in a series of experiments that became one of the most replicated and most sobering in the history of social psychology. Milgram's setup was simple. A participant arrives at Yale University and is told they will be involved in a study of learning and memory. They are introduced to another person, actually a Confederate, an actor working with Milgram, who is designated the learner. The participant is designated the teacher. The teacher's job is to administer an electric shock to the learner every time the learner answers a question incorrectly, and to increase the voltage with each wrong answer. The shock generator in front of the teacher goes from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, up to 450 volts, labeled simply TREPI once, labeled simply TREPI 1, out of sight. The teacher hears the learner's voice through a wall. As the experiment progresses and the shocks apparently increase, the learner's responses escalate from grunts of discomfort to protests, to demands to be released, to screams to, at the highest voltages, an ominous silence. The teacher at various points expresses doubt, discomfort, a desire to stop. The experimenter, a man in a gray lab coat representing institutional authority, responds with one of four scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Milgram ran the study, expecting to find a small percentage of aberrant individuals who would comply all the way to the highest voltage. He estimated, based on the advice of psychiatrists and colleagues, that perhaps 1 to 3% of participants might comply fully. Presumably sadistic personality types, outliers in the distribution of human character. What he found was that 65% of participants, 65%, administered what they believed to be the maximum possible shock of 450 volts to a person who had stopped responding, not people who seemed to be enjoying it, not people who showed no distress, people who were visibly, audibly, physically uncomfortable, people who pleaded with the experimenter to let them stop, people who trembled and sweat and laughed in the high-pitched, almost hysterical way that signals extreme stress, not amusement, and then continued. The question of why they continued has occupied psychologists for 60 years. The answers have been refined and debated and complicated by subsequent research, but the core mechanism is now well understood. It is not sadism. It is not cruelty. It is not indifference. It is something that is in some ways harder to accept because it is something we all have, all the time, and that we depend on for basic social functioning. It is the mechanism of graduated commitment, the way human beings, once they have agreed to something, experience increasing psychological pressure to remain consistent with that agreement as stakes escalate. The teacher in Milgram's study did not decide all at once to harm another person. They agreed to participate in a study of learning. Then they agreed to administer a small, mild shock. Then a slightly larger one. At each step, the decision was to continue doing what they had already been doing. The escalation was so gradual that there was never a clear, obvious moment where the behavior crossed a line, and so the line moved imperceptibly with the behavior. This graduated commitment mechanism is not a character flaw or a cognitive error in the evolutionary sense. It is an adaptation. Consistency is, in most circumstances, a signal of trustworthiness. People who can be relied upon to follow through on commitments are essential to cooperative social groups. The brain that evolved to be consistent, to resist the cognitive dissonance of behaving in ways that contradict prior commitments, was a brain that made better social partners. But that same mechanism, inside a situation that has been carefully or accidentally engineered to exploit it, produces exactly what Milgram documented. The consistent following of a series of small, individually defensible steps off a moral cliff, so gradual that the bottom is invisible until you are already there. Milgram's study was replicated, in various forms, across dozens of countries over the following decades. Compliance rates varied, from the low 40s to the high 70s, depending on context, culture, and the specific conditions of the replication. But in every version, the majority complied. The majority. In every country. In every era in which the study has been run, when researchers changed the conditions, bringing the learner into the same room requiring the teacher to physically hold the learner's hand to the shock plate, removing the authority figure, adding a peer who refused to comply, compliance rates dropped significantly, but they never reached zero. In every condition, some proportion of people administered what they believed to be severe harm to another person, because the situation had arranged itself in a way that made stopping feel like the deviation from the norm, rather than the natural and obvious thing to do. There is a follow-up finding that Zimbardo documented, and that receives far less attention than the original experiment, but that may be the most important of all. In the years after the Stanford prison experiment, many of the participants were interviewed at length about their experience and its aftermath. The guards, not just Dave Eshelman, but most of the others, described a period of significant distress that followed the study, not during it. During the study, they had felt the role. Afterward, back in their ordinary lives, they felt the distance between who they had been in that basement and who they understood themselves to be. Several describe difficulty integrating the experience, not because they could not remember it or make sense of it intellectually, but because the self who had done those things felt both fully real and completely foreign. Like a dream that is remembered with perfect clarity, but that does not feel like it happened to the same person. That discontinuity is not confusion or denial. It is, psychologists now believe, an accurate perception. The self who existed in the basement of Jordan Hall in August 1971 was genuinely different from the self who existed before it and after it. Not in some metaphysical sense. In a specific neurological sense, the brain inside that situation had been running a different model of identity, a different collection of role cues, behavioral expectations, and social feedback loops. And the behavior that emerged from that model was the behavior of that identity, not the identity the participants carried with them into the world outside. This is what is meant by the power of the situation. Not that situations override identity, but that identity is, to a far greater degree than most of us have ever been told, constructed in real time from the cues the situation provides. The self you carry with you is real. It is not an illusion, but it is also not the only self you are capable of being. Under the right conditions, with the right role, the right hierarchy, the right graduated escalation of commitment, the right removal of individual accountability, the right dehumanization of an outgroup, a different self is available, one that would use your hands, your voice, your intelligence, in service of things the self you know right now would find unrecognizable. Zimbardo spent years after the study arguing that this finding was not a counsel of despair, but of responsibility. If behavior is primarily situational, then the design of situations, institutions, workplaces, schools, systems of governance is a profound moral undertaking. The people who build the situations are not neutral engineers. They are, in a real sense, shaping who people are capable of becoming while inside them. A workplace that creates conditions of de-individuation, hierarchical pressure, and diffused accountability is not just an inefficient workplace. It is a machine for producing behavior that the people inside it would, under other conditions, refuse to produce. Not because the people are weak, but because the machine is well designed. This is where the research stops being about other people, about soldiers or guards or participants in a psychology experiment, and starts being about the situations you are inside right now, not in the dramatic, obvious way, not in a way that requires you to be doing anything obviously harmful, just in the quieter, more ordinary way that most of the research actually documents, the email you wrote that was harsher than you meant it to be, because the tone of the thread had established a certain register and you matched it without deciding to. The meeting where something unfair was decided and you said nothing, not because you approved, but because the social pressure of the room had already established consensus and breaking it would have required a kind of friction you didn't generate. The way you speak about certain groups of people when you are with certain groups of people, not because you believe what you are saying, but because the situation has already told you who you are when you are there. None of these are the Stanford prison experiment, but they are the same architecture, at a smaller scale, with lower stakes, running the same machinery. The same automatic categorization. The same graduated commitment. The same gap between the self who knows their values from the outside and the self who exists inside a situation that is moving in a specific direction. What the research asks of us, not demands, asks, is a particular kind of self-knowledge that is genuinely difficult to cultivate. Not the knowledge of your values in the abstract. Anyone can recite those. The knowledge of yourself as a situated being, a being whose identity is not a fixed and reliable anchor, but a dynamic construction that is responsive, moment to moment, to the environment it inhabits. A being who is capable of more than you think in both directions. More resilience, more courage, more decency than circumstances sometimes call for, and also more compliance, more harm. More departure from your stated values than you would predict from outside the situation. Zimbardo, in his later writing, pointed to what he called situational heroism, the specific act of interrupting the automatic processing of a situation and choosing to be the person who sees it from outside. Like Christina Maslach, walking into that basement and saying, "What you are doing to these boys is terrible." That act does not require extraordinary virtue. It does not require a special kind of person. It requires, first and foremost, the recognition that you are inside a situation, that the situation has already begun constructing a version of you, and the decision to evaluate that construction rather than simply inhabit it. To ask at regular intervals whether the person this situation is making you be is the person you choose to be. That question is available to you in most of the situations you are in. Not all of them. There are situations so total, so encompassing, so well designed, by accident or intent, that the question barely surfaces. But in most of the ordinary situations of daily life, the question is available, and the research suggests that the act of asking it consistently in low-stakes moments, long before the stakes get high, is the practice that builds the neural groove, the practice that makes the question feel natural rather than alien when the situation is moving faster and the pressure is higher and the role is already half constructed before you noticed it was being built. Philip Zimbardo died in October 2024 at the age of 91. His obituaries almost universally led with the Stanford prison experiment. The study he ran for 6 days in 1971 that was terminated early and that became one of the most cited, most debated, and most humanly important pieces of research in the history of psychology. He spent the last decades of his life conducting research on heroism, specifically on what he called the banality of heroism, deliberately inverting Hannah Arendt's phrase about the banality of evil. His argument was that heroism, like evil, is not primarily a property of extraordinary people. It is primarily a response to ordinary situations that happen to require something from the people inside them. And the research on heroic responses, people who pulled strangers from burning buildings, who refused to follow orders in institutional settings, who blew whistles on corruption at personal cost, showed the same architecture as the research on harmful compliance. Role cues. Gradual commitment. The self-constructed in real time from situational signals. The difference was not in the people, but in what the situation called forth, and in whether the person inside the situation had practiced, in smaller and earlier moments, the act of interrupting the automatic and choosing the deliberate. Dave Eschliman became a high school teacher. He went on to teach for decades, and by accounts that have been gathered from his students and his colleagues, he was an exceptionally good one. Patient, empathetic, perceptive about the interior lives of teenagers. The man who became John Wayne in a basement in 1971 became someone his students trusted and respected and remembered as a genuinely kind presence in their lives. He is not evidence that the experiment was wrong about what it found. He is evidence that the self is more than any single situation's construction of it, that the architecture that makes us susceptible to becoming different selves inside different situations is the same architecture that allows us to grow, to correct, to become more than what any particular moment asked of us. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is not the lesson that the experiment is usually said to teach. It is more ambiguous, more honest, and in some ways more demanding than the warning that people are capable of evil under pressure. Because what it requires is not vigilance against one specific kind of situation. It requires a sustained, ongoing attention to the question of who you are being, right now, inside the situation you are currently in. Not who you would be in a hypothetical. Not who you were at your best, but who you are being at this moment, in the specific circumstances of your actual life, with its specific pressures and roles and hierarchies and expectations. That attention is available. It is also, like most things that matter, something that takes practice. So here is the question the whole video has been building toward, and it is not rhetorical. Think of a specific situation in your life. Not an imagined one, but a real recurring one, where you behave differently than you would if you were alone, where the presence of a role, or a hierarchy, or a group expectation shapes what you do and what you say, not in a dramatic way, in an ordinary, almost invisible way. You already know what that situation is. You thought of one before I finished the sentence. What would it cost you to be yourself in that situation instead?